At exactly 11:47 hours local time on Tuesday, May 26, 2026, Captain Rami Khalil of the Lebanese Armed Forces 11th Infantry Brigade was standing at a forward observation post on the outskirts of Tyre, South Lebanon, watching a Hermes 900 medium-altitude drone trace its holding pattern at approximately 14,000 feet above the coastal plain. He had been watching it for 41 minutes. In 4 years of service in South Lebanon, Khalil had learned to read Israeli UAV behavior the way fishermen read weather. A Hermes 900 in a holding pattern was surveillance. A Hermes 900 that broke its pattern and descended below 11,000 feet was targeting. At 11:48 hours and 22 seconds, the drone descended. Khalil had 38 seconds to get his men off the rooftop before the first GBU-39 small-diameter bomb impacted a residential block 340 meters to his north. He used 12 of them. The remaining 26 seconds were spent on the ground with his hands over his head, as the pressure wave from the secondary explosion, a fuel depot catch fire, not a weapons cache, a fuel depot, rolled across the observation post and shattered every piece of glass in the 3-story building behind him. By the time the Lebanese Red Cross ambulances reached the impact site 7 minutes later, 14 people were already confirmed dead. By nightfall, that number would reach 31, with 40 wounded. The Lebanese Health Ministry would call it one of the deadliest single days since the ceasefire had nominally taken effect in April. The IDF would release a statement 90 minutes after the strike, describing the target as a Hezbollah logistics node. The Lebanese civil defense teams working the rubble would find no weapons. They would find a ground-floor mechanics workshop, a family of 5 on the 2nd floor, and an elderly couple on the 3rd who had refused to evacuate when the neighborhood was warned 3 days earlier that IDF activity in the area was increasing. This is not a story about whether Hezbollah was present in that building. This is a story about what a country that is not at war, but is being struck as though it is, does with 38 seconds of warning and no air defense of its own. This is the story of Lebanon on May 26th, 2026, and what the architecture of that day reveals about the reality of the ceasefire that was supposed to have ended this. To understand what happened in Tyre, you have to understand what the April ceasefire actually was, and what it was not. The ceasefire agreement brokered in April 2026 was not a bilateral treaty between Israel and Lebanon. Lebanon was not a party to the conflict in any formal military sense. The Lebanese Armed Forces had not fired a single round across the blue line during the entire 2026 escalation cycle. The Lebanese state had no offensive capacity that would have justified Israeli strikes on Lebanese territory under any conventional reading of international law. What the ceasefire addressed was the operational tempo between the IDF and Hezbollah, a non-state armed actor operating inside Lebanese sovereign territory with the Lebanese state's inability to expel it as the permanent structural condition of the country's post-2006 political reality. What this means in practice is that when the ceasefire was announced, Lebanon celebrated. And when the ceasefire began to fracture, Lebanon bled, not as a combatant, but as terrain. The country was not a party to the agreement. It was the surface on which the agreement was written, and when the ink began to smear, it was Lebanese civilians who absorbed the correction. The IDF's intelligence architecture for the May 26th strikes had been building for 72 hours. Hezbollah's Unit 4400, the formation responsible for weapons transfer coordination from Syria through the Bekaa Valley into South Lebanon, had reportedly activated 2 logistics corridors that Israeli military intelligence assessed as resupply routes for Kornet anti-tank missile systems and Burkan rocket artillery components. The corridors ran through Tyre's southern industrial district and through the village of Bint Jabail, 18 kilometers to the northeast. Israeli surveillance assets, the Hermes 900, a second Heron TP operating at higher altitude as a relay node, and a classified electro-optical satellite pass at 0340 hours that morning, had generated a targeting package that the IDF's Southern Command assessed as meeting the threshold for time-sensitive strike authorization. The Lebanese Armed Forces Southern Command in Sidon received no notification. The UNIFIL Force Commander at Nakura received no notification. The Lebanese Civil Defense Regional Coordinator for Tyre received no notification. Under the terms of the April ceasefire arrangement, Israel was not required to provide advance notification notification for strikes it categorized as defensive responses to active resupply activity. This was the operational clause that Hezbollah's logistics planners had consistently exploited by embedding transit activity within civilian infrastructure. And it was the same clause that the IDF consistently invoked to justify strikes that the Lebanese state could neither prevent nor legally contest. By 1200 hours, 3 additional strikes had occurred. The second hit a warehouse on the southern industrial periphery of Tyre that Lebanese security officials would later confirm had been used intermittently by a Hezbollah-affiliated construction company. The third hit a road junction 2 kilometers north of the city, where an Israeli intelligence assessment had identified a vehicle carrying what was described in the IDF statement as dual-use electronic components. The vehicle was destroyed. The 2 occupants were killed. Their names, released the following morning by the Lebanese Health Ministry, were a 34-year-old electrical contractor and his 19-year-old assistant. Neither man had any documented affiliation with Hezbollah. Whether they were knowingly transporting material for Hezbollah or were subcontracted unknowingly into a supply chain that served Hezbollah purposes is a question that no court will ever resolve, because the evidence was vaporized at 12:03 hours by a Rafael Spike NLOS missile fired from an IDF Panther helicopter operating 8 kilometers south of the Blue Line. The fourth strike was different. It was the one that broke the day open. At 13:18 hours, an Israeli airstrike hit a 3-story residential building in the Al-Bas Palestinian refugee camp on the northern approach to Tyre. The camp is home to approximately 10,000 people, majority Palestinian refugees and their descendants, administered under UNRWA mandate, but physically located within Lebanese sovereign territory. The IDF stated that the targeted structure contained a Hezbollah command and communications node operating from the building's basement. Lebanese officials, UNRWA emergency coordinators, and 3 independent journalists who reached the site within 2 hours disputed this characterization. What they found was consistent with the floor plan of a residential building that had suffered a near-vertical penetrating strike by a weapon consistent in blast radius with a GBU-53 Stormbreaker, a GPS-guided glide bomb capable of distinguishing between armored and soft targets, but not between a basement communications room and the 6 apartments above it. 11 of the day's 31 dead came from this building. The Lebanese Armed Forces response to the strikes was defined entirely by the parameters of what the LAF actually is, a conventional military organization with no air defense assets capable of engaging fixed-wing Israeli aircraft operating above 8,000 feet, no artillery assets forward deployed to South Lebanon under the terms of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, and no political authorization from the Lebanese cabinet, a body that has not achieved a formal quorum on security decisions involving Israel since the government formation crisis of 2025, to respond with any kinetic measure. What the LAF could do, and did, was deploy additional ground forces to the impact sites, establish cordon perimeters, coordinate with UNIFIL sector commanders on damage assessment reporting, and file a formal protest through the Lebanese Foreign Ministry to the UN Secretary General's office in New York. The protest was filed at 1500 hours. The UN acknowledged receipt at 1847 hours. No Security Council emergency session was convened. Russia and China, both of whom would normally have moved for an emergency session under previous operational patterns, were both diplomatically engaged in the Iran negotiation process and assessed, according to Lebanese diplomatic sources, that pushing a Lebanon resolution at this moment would complicate the Hormuz back channel that Pakistan was running in parallel. Lebanon was, once again, the expendable variable in a calculation made in rooms it was not invited into. On the ground in Tyre, the human reality of the day was being managed by people with no access to any of those rooms. Dr. Fatima Nassar, chief of emergency medicine at the Jabal Amel Government Hospital in Tyre, had been on shift since 600 hours. By 1400 hours, she had received 23 trauma patients, 9 of whom required immediate surgical intervention. Her hospital had received no resupply of O-negative blood since April 12th. The hospital's backup generator, which had been running continuously since the main power grid in South Lebanon dropped to 4-hour daily supply in March, was consuming fuel at a rate that would exhaust current reserves within 11 days. The hospital's liaison officer had submitted 3 resupply requests to the Lebanese Health Ministry's Emergency Logistics Directorate in Beirut. 2 had received automated acknowledgement receipts. 1 had received no response at all. Dr. Nassar operated on a 7-year-old girl with a penetrating thoracic fragment wound for 3 hours and 40 minutes, beginning ending at 14:12 hours. The girl survived. Her mother, who had been in the same room when the first strike hit their building, did not reach the hospital. She was identified from personal documents recovered from the rubble at 19:30 hours. She was 29 years old. This is the operational reality that the phrase, "one of the deadliest days since the ceasefire," describes. Not a military operation in the conventional analytical sense, not a force-on-force engagement that produces battle damage assessments and lessons learned reports. A day in which a state with no functioning air defense, no political unity, no operational sovereignty over a portion of its own territory, and no reliable power grid absorbed 4 precision airstrikes, lost 31 people, and filed a protest that no one with the power to act upon it chose to act upon. The Lebanese Armed Forces Intelligence Directorate spent the hours after the strikes constructing its own assessment of what had actually happened, not as a counter-narrative to the IDF's targeting justification, but as an internal operational document intended to inform the LAF's force posture in South Lebanon over the following weeks. The assessment's core finding was operationally significant. Of the 4 strike locations on May 26th, 2 showed evidence of prior Hezbollah infrastructure activity that had been vacated between 48 and 72 hours before the strikes. The LAF's assessment posited 2 possible explanations. First, that Israeli strike timing was delayed by targeting review cycles, and Hezbollah had relocated before the strike authorization cleared. Second, that Hezbollah had deliberately maintained a visible signature at those locations until shortly before the strikes, using its own knowledge of Israeli surveillance patterns to manufacture a targeting trigger that would draw IDF kinetic action onto locations that were no longer operationally active, thereby achieving civilian casualties that served Hezbollah's information operation objectives without expending any of its own assets. The LAF assessment did not reach a conclusion between these 2 explanations. It noted both. It filed the document under restricted classification. It changed nothing about what had happened on May 26th to the 31 people who were dead. What the day revealed about Hezbollah's operational posture in South Lebanon is as important as what it revealed about the IDF's. Hezbollah's Unit 4400 had not stopped its logistics activity after the April ceasefire. It had restructured it. Shipment cycles that previously ran on 72-hour intervals had been compressed to 18-hour windows. Transit vehicles were being rotated through civilian commercial pools, rental companies, construction contractors, agricultural transport operators, with payments made in cash through a network of intermediaries that created sufficient legal ambiguity to make vehicle identification difficult without ground-level informant access. Infrastructure nodes that previously occupied fixed locations had been dispersed into a mobile network of smaller storage points, each below the threshold that Israeli intelligence assessed as warranting a time-sensitive strike. The logistics architecture had been disaggregated specifically to exploit the gap between what Israeli surveillance could detect and what it could strike without crossing a civilian harm threshold that would generate international pressure. This is the strategic logic that makes Lebanon's position uniquely impossible. Hezbollah has spent 2 decades learning to make itself indistinguishable from the civilian infrastructure of South Lebanon, not because it does not care about civilian casualties among the population it claims to represent, but because it has calculated, correctly in operational terms, that this indistinguishability is its most durable form of strategic protection. Israel cannot strike what it cannot distinguish from civilian targets without accepting the international cost of civilian casualties. Lebanon cannot expel Hezbollah from the territory it occupies without triggering a civil conflict that would destroy the Lebanese Armed Forces as a functional institution within weeks. UNIFIL cannot interpose itself between Hezbollah logistics corridors and Israeli strike packages because its mandate, its rules of engagement, and its contributing nation's political tolerance for casualties all preclude offensive action. The result is a permanent condition in which Lebanon functions simultaneously as a sovereign state, a contested battlefield, and a humanitarian disaster zone. 3 categories that are normally sequential in conflict analysis, but in Lebanon exist in permanent, simultaneous superposition. By 2200 hours on May 26th, the Lebanese Red Cross had completed its initial casualty documentation from all 4 strike sites. UNIFIL's force commander had submitted his incident report to the UN Department of Safety and Security in New York. The Lebanese foreign minister had appeared on LBC television to condemn the strikes and call for international accountability. Captain Rami Khalil of the 11th Infantry Brigade was back at his observation post by 1900 hours. The Hermes 900 was still there, back in its holding pattern at 14,000 feet. In 4 years, Khalil had never once seen the holding pattern end without a strike following within 90 minutes. He had never once been given warning in time to do anything other than take personal cover. He had never once received instructions from his chain of command that told him anything other than to document, report, and do not engage. He watched the drone for another 40 minutes before his shift rotation arrived, and he was relieved. Walking back to the brigade's forward position, he passed 2 Lebanese civil defense workers carrying a third body bag from the fuel depot rubble. The recovery teams had been working for 10 hours. They had another 6 hours of work ahead of them before the site would be cleared. The bag was light. Khalil did not stop walking. The ceasefire that began in April 2026 did not end on May 26th in any formal sense. There was no declaration, no crossing of a named threshold, no activation of an escalation protocol by any party with the authority to name what happened as the end of something. What there was instead was a Tuesday in which 31 people died in a country that was not at war, in a city whose name will not appear in most of the week's geopolitical summaries, struck by weapon systems that cost more per unit than Jabal Amel Hospital's entire operating budget. The Hermes 900 is still up there. The question Lebanon cannot answer, the question its military cannot answer, its government cannot answer, and its people have long since stopped expecting anyone outside their borders to answer, is not whether the next strike is coming. It is whether there is anything left to be struck before the country itself simply stops being a functioning entity and becomes permanently and completely a theater of operations with no state attached to it. That process is not a future risk. It is a present condition. And on May 26th, 2026, it had one of its worst days since April. No one with the power to stop it was watching anything except a drone that had already moved on to its next holding pattern before the ambulances had finished loading. Stay informed, because the people who live under that holding pattern cannot afford to look away, and neither, if you are paying attention, can you.